either way, we'll just keep moving forward. Okay. So a little bit of background on the impetus to try to be more effective and efficient comes from, I think, whenever I was about 10 or so, growing up in an Indian family, where the concept that an A- is a D, a B is an F, and nothing's generally ever good enough. But that also means that you come in with this mindset that the expectation is basically perfection. And so when you have that, in addition to one of my mentors was my aunt. She's the vice provost of Carnegie Mellon. I got to sit down with her when I was 12, and she said, well, in order to get into the top schools, you need to be a well-rounded person. You have to be in athletics, in all the different math and science programs. You need to focus on all the different things that people want you to in relation to being a well-rounded person. So this also meant like being the head of different clubs and associations, start your own club and association, and be generally diverse. So that also meant I was coming into high school, Model UN, mock trial, cross country, lacrosse, marching band, pep band. I had my own brass orchestra. I composed my own music, and probably 100 other things, in addition to needing to get perfect grades. So that forced me to think, how can I manage all of this effectively while still having sanity? And I'll definitely say it didn't work out between the ages of maybe 12 and 20 or so. But along that journey, I was able to figure out some techniques because of that demand. So the first thing, specifically for education, that was is and was a fantastic methodology that I got to learn is, for short-term memory, the Leitner methodology, and for long-term memory, the Pimsleur method. So the Leitner method is not the steps that are listed out here, but it follows a very similar structure. So this is, you're cramming for a test or something that you need to do as a presentation tomorrow. As opposed to long-term memory, the requirement is you're trying to remember over a longer period of time. So why do you even need to memorize it or have any of these techniques? Well, this Ebbinghaus curve shows that over anything that you have exposure to, from immediate to a month after, you only have about a 21% retention of the information, which basically means that no valuable retention is left in most cases. Now, there is some adjustments to this technique I've made specifically, but for general purposes, most of the things that we do when we're an adult or in business or in life is typically, from a learning standpoint, which is mainly skill sets, is more long-term memory. And also, at that time, typically whenever I was in school, it still was longer term, because when you're doing like AP courses and SAT, your retention may be short term for the test that you have to, or quiz that you have to take in the short term, but typically they're more weighted for long-term memory, like end of semester and end of year type finals. And so you need to have more of a Pimsleur method. Pimsleur method is actually very famous because he also wrote a whole language audio program called the Pimsleur language method, or language system. And it uses the same techniques as an audio approach as opposed to a reading approach, but still it's the same approach. The other way that I've heard it called is segmented learning. So basically, you learn whatever it is that you're doing. We'll talk about some advanced techniques at the end on how to gain a better effectiveness on the types of learning. But after you learn whatever it is that you're trying to learn, you take a break and then go back at it again. Go through the whole process again. Then after a day, go through the process again. 2 weeks, basically half a month, and then 2 to 3 months later. So in school, specifically trying to ace everything, you know, one, I was never academically inclined. As good of grades as I got, which were pretty much perfect grades all throughout school and great scores on everything, I really didn't have any passion for any of the content that I was learning. But using this methodology, I was able to retain a huge amount of information that generally was irrelevant, but I was able to actually retain it from year to year to build a foundational approach. So having gone to Georgia Tech, which is an engineering school, and within engineering, I did computer science as my primary first degree. That is a very foundational approach to education. Versus liberal arts, most liberal arts programs, you can piecemeal classes and courses together, as opposed to an engineering discipline, you have to layer. So you have to memorize or retain the information from years and years ago, a decade ago, as foundational elements to build your knowledge base. So this kind of Pimsleur method actually doesn't necessarily flip the curve upside down, but what you're able to do is get to closer to an 80% retention rather than a 20% retention within the exact same time frame. And then going through life later on, you know, most of these techniques, I actually have used the same kind of approach to master the same techniques. So all the books that I'm going to be mentioning and all these techniques, I actually reread them typically every 3 years to 5 years for the last 20 years straight. So I'll read anything that I think is a foundational element to learning or a methodology. I'll reread those on a 2 to 5 year cycle. And they kind of coincide with my annual retreats, and I'll talk about quarterly annual retreats. Okay, so did well in high school, extremely well. Looking back at it, I think at the time it was never good enough. So going to Georgia Tech was a failure because it was not a top 10 school in the world. It was, I think at the time, like 25th or something like that. And unbeknownst to me, that doesn't actually matter in engineering. It was a top 3 school in every single discipline in engineering. But looking at that mindset where it wasn't good enough, the good thing about it is that your standards are held very high, and you have a very internal motivation, although mostly negative, to try to achieve. But what I discovered when I was in middle school, going into high school, is I was more passionate about how to build companies. And one of the main reasons why I went to tech is, one, Atlanta was a great business marketplace. I thought it was going to be a lot easier than Boston and Silicon Valley to break in without a lot of connections and relationships. And Georgia Tech was paying me to go to school. So all those combined made it fairly easy. So I looked at leaving high school as a function of, you know, I got to let go of the things that my academic focus and try to focus on a more business approach. So what happens though is, to do both, no one ever told me that going to Georgia Tech was as painful and as miserable as it was. At the time, looking back, probably about 5 years after I graduated, it was ranked #1 most miserable college in the entire country. And several of the employees have actually gone there, and they might be able to attest. I always say it's a hate-love relationship. You pretty much hate it the entire time that you're there, and then years later, typically 5+ years later, you start to appreciate what it is. But at the time, I knew I wanted to start companies, but I didn't really know why or what, or, you know, get any alignment in terms of life. So as many people, I looked at college as a medium to figure out by myself time in terms of determining what I was trying to accomplish, what was my purpose. And one of the frameworks that I used was Personal Power 2. Tony Robbins had done this program in 1980 something. And so I was a little late to the game, but I still got it on cassette tape, and then eventually CD, and then eventually now I have it on-demand MP3 format on Dropbox. But, you know, it's one thing to be overwhelmed with a bunch of stuff, which if you actually look at my calendar, it's still kind of like this. But at the same time, there's a balance, and I know exactly why I'm doing what it is that I'm doing. So that's, I think, one of the initial cornerstones of trying to be very effective, because it's not necessarily about time management. It's knowing why you're trying to do what you're trying to do, which accelerates what you're doing. For example, if you see yourself or see kids when they're at play, they never say, oh, this is such a long, hard process, but they could be playing for the entire day and not have any expenditure of energy where it's exhausting. So that has to do more with, they know why. For them, it may be as simple as, I'm having fun. That creates energy. We'll go a little bit later into energy management. But the core basis of that energy is the why. Why do you exist? And I'm not going to go into the details, but Personal Power 2 program was the most effective way that I have seen. And I've used that method. I almost do that every single year now, over 20 years, to go through their methodology of the questions to get you into alignment of what's holding you back, your belief systems, your value system, writing it down, codifying it, and making sure that you understand it for yourself. Now, within Personal Power 2, beyond just writing it down, there's a methodology called neuro-linguistic programming. NLP is a very old and famous methodology of getting yourself simply into a peak state. It could be peak negative, peak positive, to condition your belief systems. So, for example, I remember when I was younger, still coming in high school, it may seem laughable today, but I was addicted to chewy chocolate Chips Ahoy. I would eat it by the box. I wouldn't necessarily eat one or two. It was an addiction. So what I did is I actually used NLP methodology to get myself into an extremely negative state on my belief system around chewy chocolate Chips Ahoy. But that's not usually enough. What you want to do is you need to substitute or transition that feeling that you have to something else that's healthy, enabling, and within your value and belief system. So for me, that was getting healthy. Holistically and then in more detail, different areas of life, both in nutrition, in training, et cetera, et cetera. And now I really actually have no sweet tooth at all. Other than scheduled times of eating chocolate, which many people know, then I schedule the time whenever I indulge in my food or drink. I don't really eat any sugar at all, any processed food or anything like that. And I would actually attribute that over the last 20 years, that's been a function directly of training. Train my mind and my state and my being of how I want to be versus what I don't believe is effective for where I want to go. So again, that goes back to the why. And then this is an actual technique that you can do methodically to train yourself to change your belief system and how you feel about different things. And the other thing is, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and it's repetitive. And most of this process that I go through here, I do it every quarter. I do a personal retreat in addition to corporate retreats for companies. But what I do is I'll sit down with myself, typically outside of the state. I'll go to a cabin, take the family on the beach, go to some kind of vacation, block off that time, usually on Friday through a whole weekend, and just sit down, go through a Personal Power 2 program, and on an annual basis, and then on a quarterly basis, I'm really reviewing what I've done, what I haven't achieved, what I want to achieve in the different areas of life, and then go through the NLP methodology to basically realign and reprogram myself to achieve what I want. So once you kind of know why you're doing what you're doing, meaning what you want out of life, that doesn't necessarily help you with this mess of stuff that you've got going on. That just aligns you to make sure you're focused on doing what you want to do and why you want to do it. So to take all this, there's all this stimulus. There is text messages, every social media notification, phone calls, emails, et cetera, et cetera. GTD methodology, and Tim jokes that we have these get shit done cups and pads around the office. Getting things done methodology popularized by David Allen in his first book. He's had, I think, 2 or 3 books of the same updated version. Is really, you take all this stuff in and you, like an Aikido master. An Aikido master is really good at redirection of energy. So difference between if you're attacking somebody versus defending somebody versus Aikido is that you can take any attack and create it as a defense. So you're always redirecting. And that's basically this whole mindset of GTD methodology, which is you take the things that are coming at you and effortlessly are able to redirect it into the right area. So it can be the inbox, it could be a certain scheduled time that you're going to be spending with it. For example, part of it, and I'll go into advanced techniques at the end, is you do need to have the ability for you to be in control of the environment that you have. What I mean by that is, if you look at my phone, I have no notifications on email, no text message notifications, no social media notifications. The only notifications I get are my plane notifications. So literally while I'm in flight, if there's any issues with the plane, I get a notification. And that is critical to life. Other than that, it may sound odd, but if my wife is calling me or somebody is texting me and I'm not in a place or state or mind that I want to approach those different areas, they won't get a pickup on the call. But at the same time, I know that there are important things that are going on. So typically I have 4-hour increments where I spend about 30 minutes to make sure that I'm catching up. Sometimes there are also transition periods. So if I'm going to the car, in the car, I'll actually go through all the text messages, phone calls before I even leave. So then I can clear it and get on to the next thing, same with emails. And I'll have transition times from early morning throughout the day, typically in 4-hour increments throughout the entire day. That's more than enough time for you to get back to everything that's not important, if that makes any sense, what I call low priority. GTD methodology also allows you to take certain things that are low priority and short time duration to deal with and attack those very quickly. And then the bigger things gets you to focus on how to make it into a project. So you can take it as a project either by yourself or with a team to make sure that you're executing it on a consistent basis. So, going back to going into college, I had all these different classes, a lot of friends, creating new friends, and still family obligations. But still, my main focus was how do I build a company successfully? So it's very overwhelming whenever, especially since I didn't know Georgia Tech was as miserable as it was. But what that forced me to do is say, hey, this is a very overwhelming amount of stuff that's coming at me. Homework assignments, extremely high demanding professors, lots of tests, lots of examinations, plus my own life aspirations and all this other stuff, and all these things hitting me. But with GTD methodology, I was able to figure out exactly how to put it in the place that it needed to and schedule it when it needed to get done and still focus on what I wanted to focus on. So one of the big things from a practical standpoint that I've introduced more recently in the last decade is Inbox Zero. GTD methodology was actually a physical filing system. This is probably not necessarily before the internet, but before most of us were able to use efficient online calendar systems. There was no iPhone. This is more than 10 years before the iPhone. So you had PDAs, but most people weren't using a PDA as they were using scheduling calendars of a physical folder system. So using a lot of that was physical. Now it transitioned into this whole concept of Inbox Zero, which is one of the scariest areas that I see for most business people or people in a career is their inbox. I've seen inboxes of like 5,000 in their inbox, and I'm surprised that they can function. At the same time, maybe it's a good thing. You get so overwhelmed, you just don't care. You just focus on what you need to focus on. So that is actually part of my methodology later on. But Inbox Zero is that typically every single week, usually by Monday, my inbox is zero, meaning there's nothing in my inbox. That doesn't necessarily mean I've accomplished everything for everything that has come at me. But even things like books that I want to read, messages that I need to get back to, I'll actually email myself and schedule it. And there's a snooze function on now the Outlook iPhone app. There's snooze function. I see it on almost all applications nowadays. If you don't have one, it's almost, I think it's mandatory. The snooze function is not just for it to disappear, but you can then schedule it to reappear at a time that you'd be focused on, when you want to actually attack the problem. What happens then is inbox zero allows you to clear your mind and not worry about anything. So you can just focus on what you need to, and you feel a lot more in power of your environment because it's clear. You can then choose what it is that you want to accomplish as opposed to having the world demand from you what they want you to accomplish. So still, as I was going through the why, and there's still a lot of stuff, it was still overwhelming because yes, I could categorize and do things later and later, but I wanted to get to a state where it was a peaceful, exciting process as opposed to a overbearing, overwhelming, like an Atlas Shrugged type of experience where you feel like the whole weight of the world is on your back. So 2 books that I think codify it on the state of being that you want to get into, most famously by the book Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And what he talks about is the state where people can get to where you kind of forget what's going on and things get accomplished. Sometimes I know myself and some people get into that whenever you are cleaning up your house, where maybe initially it feels like a task, but then it kind of, everything disappears and you start accomplishing everything so rapidly, so quickly that you don't even notice time. Another thing is I see this with runners. Typically, depending on the length of distance that you run, if you're doing half or long distance, half marathon or full marathon type training, typically your first mile is very exhausting. Then you get to the runner's high, which is you kind of float and time kind of disappears. And then the next 5 or even 10 miles is kind of this effortless feeling. Tiger Woods, whatever your feelings of Tiger Woods, talked about, and I've seen several of his interviews, where when he was in 2001, when he was at the top of his game, he identically described the state of flow that Mihaly writes about, where he actually would forget and could not remember swinging the club or hitting the ball or anything happening. And that's also the state of flow where things happen effortlessly and you almost can't even remember because you have such a high level of mastery and you're in the state of flow. So going through that, that's kind of what I wanted to experience. I wanted to get all these things accomplished, but I didn't want to feel overburdened by it. I wanted to have this state of flow. And the other thing is the joke with anything with time management, it has nothing to do with time management. Because if you're sick and have the flu, you could spend all day long trying to work on a task, but you're going to get nothing accomplished. It has more to do with energy management than it does to do with time management. So big integrated component of flow is the state of feeling. So managing your energy is multifaceted because it's not purely, hey, I've set this from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. to work on this activity. If you're not in a peak state where you have a lot of power, a lot of energy, as a result of symptomatically because of great nutrition, good health, good sleep, and a good balanced life with no distractions around you, that will allow 1 hour to accomplish what you would in days of time. And potentially, it's an 80-20, where you're spending such a little bit of time to accomplish a tremendous amount of impact. And that's kind of the whole thesis of what this whole thing is. Tony Schwartz is a very fantastic author. He created this consulting practice called the Energy Project. And he has a lot of books around how to manage energy and his energy audit on his website that you guys can take. And I think they use it at Google when they're doing an evaluation. So what I've been talking about is yourself, the me. and dealing with how to be more effective and efficient. But the reality is, you are limited. In fact, I don't care how smart you are, there is no way for you to build an Apple if there's only Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs and Tim Cook sitting around a table and nobody else around them. They could work as hard as they want, but they would have never made, we'll say, Apple 2.0 as successful. So, I mean, this is obvious. If you're building an organization, you need a team. But it's not necessarily obvious what about the team and how the dynamics of the team need to be managed to be able to be effective at scale. So one of the first books that I looked at whenever I was making progress, but it was all about me, and I needed to figure out how could I disconnect, and I'd seen this concept of business and scale and other people, but this whole concept of never having enough time, pushed me back and say, well, even if I was super efficient, in great state of flow, doing everything I want, in perfect alignment with who I am, but only by myself, and only focusing on the stuff I need to do, I'm going to be pretty inefficient with it and ineffective with what I'm trying to accomplish from a time standpoint, right? So 80-20 allowed me to recodify Victor Pareto's principle, which is the 80-20 rule, where he did this study where both in wealth and the number of, specifically he had this study in wealth. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It was, I want to say during the Renaissance time frame. You can check that out and correct me if I'm wrong. But the theory was that at that time, 20%, less than 20% of the population was controlling over 80% of the wealth. That number is actually way more extreme today. It's closer to 0.1% controls about 60% of the wealth, at least in the United States, and most likely globally. So there's no judgment on that. It's just a reality. 80-20 is everywhere. And I believe it's a principle, just like Richard Koch wrote about, where it's almost a fundamental truth that's around you. One of the things that I say that sounds very extreme, that a lot of people probably will never implement, but I know for certain has always made an impact, is 80% of the emails that you have are complete waste of time. You need to just get rid of it. 80% of everything that anybody says to you, 80% of your friends, 80% of everything around you, stuff, people, what you do with your life, is a complete ineffective use of your time that generates almost no results. So the trick, though, is yes, you can focus on the 20%, but you get this compounding effect when you start working with a team. So that compounding effect of that 20%, now it could be a 199, it could be a 595, but the key is, if you look at any company, including Lending Science, there's only, I know there's less than 20% of the clients that generate more than 80% of the profits of the company. And, you could even say that in most companies, I'm not saying Lending Science, although who knows, that 80% of the impact of the company is also generated by 20% of the people. And actually, if you look at life, most people are not working 80% of the day, they're working less than 20% of the day. Even though that the traditional corporate architecture is 9 to 5, which is out of 24 hours within the day, what is that, 8 hours. So you kind of look at it even from that standpoint, nobody's actually working 8 hours a day. If you're working a 9 to 5 labor hour job, even in that environment, typically you're not working that many hours. I think based upon a couple things that I had read a while ago, that it's less than 4.5 hours of actual work that's being done, if that. So you take 4 divided by 24, I don't even know what that is exactly, but it's definitely more of a ratio like this. So that's one way to look at it. The other thing is, the way I kind of look at it is also, of the things that I'm doing, let me focus on the 20% that actually makes a difference, and the actual impact, real impact. And then expand that to 80%, and then do it again, and again, and again, and again. And usually on an annual basis, through my life, I always look at that. What is it that I'm doing that's 80%? What's the 20% that's the most impact? And how can I scale that to become 80% of my life? And then again and again and again. And that also applies not only to business, it also applies to family, because I see a lot of people who spend time with their family and friends, but don't really have any meaningful relationships. Versus what I believe is I can spend less than 30 minutes with very intense focused time with purpose to create meaning with each one of my kids, 3 kids, married, and then extended family, friends, employees, everybody else, that you can concentrate a very small amount of time, create a massive impact within that shorter period of time that can last for a long period of time. And so you can, this works in all aspects of life from that standpoint. Now, that creates internal scale, but then this also applies to business and what you're actually doing from a career standpoint too, which is, yes, I do believe that 80% of what you're doing, no matter who you are in the company, is a complete waste of time. And that only 20% of the activities, if not less than that, actually make the difference. So the question isn't necessarily, do I just drop everything, which is possible, that is a possible way. But really it's to understand, why is it that I'm spending 80% of my time on things that don't matter? And that's where you start to work with people. So on a people standpoint, it's not, I believe it's partially learned, trial by fire, and direct experience, where you need to work with individuals that specifically are in an effective method. Ideally, they already have all these other beliefs within them. That's always easy, is to hire people that have a similar value system, which I try to. But also working with them in a context where it's not you telling other people what to do, but working with them and who they are to maximize what it is that you're trying to accomplish very ineffectively. So for example, if I'm trying to do financial analysis, I know it sounds one-on-one today, we use systems like Excel and the accounting system, but that's actually a newer phenomenon. It's not that long ago that people had to write most of this stuff down on paper or some kind of non-linear algebra functioning Excel system where you're manually calculating stuff. But, you know, sure, it's been like 15 years plus, but, you know, even 20 years. But I think the bigger point is that those types of systems help you to scale. Now, if you can take that and any type of repetitive action that you do, you can automate today, you want to do that. And then beyond that, there's this interfacing phase where it's like, say for instance, you're an analyst and you need to get X things accomplished. I can definitely tell from an analyst, from personal experience working with the team, that 80% of the stuff that they're doing are repetitive tasks, that they're doing the same thing over and over and over again. So the key is not to keep doing that thing so you keep your job by being busy. The key is to scale your value by figuring out the balance between cost of investment to automate it to the amount of time that you're spending on it. And if you don't take the initiative as an analyst to try to automate these processes, one, nobody else is going to. Two, you would actually be able to, if you even personally were able to automate it, do the 80-20, forget the team for a second, and you automated the process, you would have 80% more time to sit back and relax because you've been able to automate repetitive tasks and repetitive actions. Now, I always joke, one of the only things I've learned from being of Indian descent is outsourcing. And it's a life philosophy. I don't want to do anything that is not of the absolute most critical value creation for all the things that I know personally. So what I mean by that is I want to focus on the things that I know is going to maximize my impact and work with other people on the other areas of my life that still need to get accomplished and are critical, but is not the absolute most maximum focus value of my time personally. But in order to do that, to work with the team to accomplish that, the Scrum Agile methodology, is it Jeffrey Sutherland? I believe it's Jeffrey Sutherland. Jonathan Sutherland, something Sutherland, who developed the Scrum methodology based on the Agile principles, which is very popular in software development, is that you got to get everybody on your team. It could be just one other person on the same page, day one. The second thing is they need to understand the value that's going to be created by doing this. Now, you need to then cut it not into a gigantic 6-month project that has step by step by step all laid out, but focusing on a sprint methodology where you compress everything into small modules. Those small modules then allow you to focus on what you need to do right now, focus on getting it done, then getting feedback, typically in a 1 to 2 week cycle. So you give your team the ability to work on it and come back to you to give feedback based on hopefully your experience and wisdom or collective wisdom of the team. And you don't want to start doing large projects. Sure, you can have a vision. We already talked about the why. Put your vision down. I personally have over a 100-year plan, and a 50 and a 25 and a 10 and a 5. But that actually gets reset and redone every single quarter. So I scrap my entire plan and redo it, my 100-year plan every quarter, which kind of makes sense and doesn't make sense. Be like, why would you write a 100-year plan if you don't scrap it every single 90 days? Well, the reality is between last 90 days and this 90 days, if you know anything about me, my whole life changes every 90 days. It's gigantic change, very, very rapidly, and happens very consistently. So I need to make sure that what I'm working on is a short enough duration to take into consideration the new information I have, the new circumstances, the environment, the economy, capital resources, HR resources, all the corporate resources, life things that are happening, and then work with the team to keep on iterating like that. Now, obviously, this is not good if you are trying to build 100,000 units of a chair that are identical. In that kind of system, it's a waterfall approach that makes more sense because you have specific machines with specific process and specific sequence that's already been tested, tried and true to create rapid output. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about team effectiveness and how to work with the team with sure these other principles and techniques, but to be most effective. And a huge component of that is communication. So constant daily communication, weekly stand-up meetings, and making sure that things are going across all the different areas, but still understanding that 80% of the stuff that you're still focusing on is a waste of time. And having a team that's okay that it's dynamic and rapidly evolving. Not all people are okay with that, but if you start with that kind of methodology and communicate in that type of architecture, then you can get a lot of things done quickly. Now, caveat to that, and I'm guilty of this, is that if you take a Scrum Agile approach towards things that are repetitive, like annual, like say for instance, I know that I got to do taxes. I hate to, do that. Don't want to do it, but it happens every single year. We got to do quarterly tax payments every single quarter. I got to do the estimate. So that is a great way where you can automate, build framework so that you can just reapproach what you've already built rather than building from scratch. You don't want to use a Scrum Agile approach on things that are consistent, repetitive, and mandatory. Taxes, any calendar dates, like, obviously I don't have to think about my birthday because it's on Christmas Day. Every single year, the same time, same, not necessarily the same place, but the process is the same. So stop thinking about it, get it out of your head. That's also goes back to the GTD methodology. But you don't need a Scrum approach to figure out when taxes are going to be done. If you're doing that, you're wasting time at that point. So there's a balance with that. You don't want to start from scratch, throw away all the work that you did before for next year's taxes. You want to build on it so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so that's the end of kind of the conversation, but I do want to kind of go through the specific models that I talked about, and then since we have a little bit of time, go into some of the advanced techniques. So we talked about neurolinguistic programming, and you should all be able to get access to the slides so you can see each one of these. Personal Power 2. GTD by David Allen. I think I may have, yeah, that's his spelling. Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Energy Management by Tony Schwartz. Grit Score, which I didn't talk about, is kind of, once you kind of know what you're trying to accomplish with life and you're very, very focused on it, the Grit Score, written by Angela Duckworth. Great book, very fun book, easy to read, quick to read. There's this story that she talks about where West Point grads, or I should say people going into West Point, have very high scores and they have very high recommendations and they have all the characteristics to be able to be successful in West Point, and yet they have about a 60% attrition rate. And in the Navy SEALs is a very similar issue. We have almost a 75, 80% attrition rate, even though the number of people that are coming in almost look identical. So what's the difference between the ones that came in and were successful versus the ones who came in and were not successful? By scale, it has to do with their grit. And that grit is a component of the alignment of who they are. They know absolutely why that in the extreme worst case scenario where they're in complete pain, misery, and they hate wanting to be there, why they need to be there, and why nothing will stop them no matter how terrible and miserable it is. And that grit score is, I wouldn't say it's a judgment, it's more of an alignment tool. If you have a very high grit score, that means that you are very much in alignment with what you are trying to accomplish with who you are as a person. So that's where the grit score comes in. It also has to do with a personality, a little bit of a personality, where if you have a general person that is very stubborn, very focused, has an ownership mentality, and nothing will disrupt you from staying focused and accomplishing things over very long periods of time, you're going to have a higher grit score. But typically that also goes hand in hand with what you're trying to do. If you really hate what you're trying to do, but you are very stubborn and focused, usually doesn't last for long periods of time. So grit score is an alignment tool. 80-20, Richard Koch, like we talked about. Scrum, I think How to Do a Lot of Things in Half the Time by Jeffrey Sutherland. And then Leitner system versus the Pimsleur method. Okay, so bonus on advanced techniques. So here's some tools and advanced techniques, very granular. One that I use every morning and ideally twice a day is waking up as early as possible. Typically around 5 to 5:30 in the morning is a good time before everybody gets up, and going into a meditative state. That could be with strength training, and then I typically do a 20-minute TM meditation, which for me is fairly simple. It's basically a sound sitting quietly for 20 minutes. If you do it for 1 minute, you're fine. Just do it consistently. As Bruce Lee said, he's not afraid of a person who in one day kicked 1,000 times. He's afraid of the person who kicked one time for 1,000 days. That consistency of habit is critical. That day one creates a tremendous amount of energy in me. If you see me at 5 a.m., 6 a.m. in the morning, I probably have more energy than I have even right now. First things first. So the most important, critical, hardest thing that is going to make the biggest difference is the only thing that you should be focused on day one. On moment one, I mean. Moment one of each day. Moment one of each week. Moment one of each year, quarter, whatever it is that you're doing. Everything else should be secondary. And which basically means you should only, that's the 80-20 focus, right? So if I'm trying to get something accomplished, for me, this presentation was very important. I got it done actually in less than 30 minutes. And I was able to do it absolute first thing after meditation and get things done rapidly and focus on. And that gets you to start getting this momentum of 80-20 again, focusing on things that absolutely and actually matter, as opposed to just focusing on a whole bunch of random stuff. Asana is a tool. You can use other types of project management tools. I switched over to Asana recently. I remember the early days, not so great. Now way more fantastic for an agile group teamwork framework, a lot of communication, ability for document management, larger projects. I don't use it for one-off tasks that I need to do, but I use it for larger project, which is this screenshot over here on the right. Pomodoro technique, very specific technique. Pomodoro method is you basically are doing 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 25-minute break. And this has been very valuable. So as a pilot, trying to learn a lot of ground school content is similar to like the SATs. When I was talking to you about the Pimsleur method, I use the Pomodoro method within the Pimsleur architecture. Actually, I use all these architectures within each other. Specifically for skills mastery, Pomodoro method is basically a, hey, I don't know anything. I'm just going to approach it for 20 minutes, then take a step back. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier on the SATs is I actually helped build an SAT prep company, and we did SAT there, MCAT, LSAT, GRE, AP, and all the AP exams, all the AP tests. There is no such, and the IQ test, there is no such thing as an intelligent person versus a non-intelligent person. There are people that have an affinity towards a lot of these methodologies that are innate more than other people, which gives them an edge. But the reality is, if you want to learn anything, I don't care if you know nothing about it, including the IQ test. Having done the IQ test so many times and actually knowing all the methodologies to score a perfect score, or very close to a perfect score. So IQ tests and SAT are very time-based. So the longer time that you spend on an IQ test, the lower your score is. SAT, there's cutoffs on your time, unless you get, whatever medical, extensions on your time. So this same process works actually when you're live learning how to physically fly a plane. So yes, it feels as scary the first time as it sounds, unless you're already a pilot. And even as a pilot, it's always good to have a healthy dose of fear. I don't want to come into flying a plane not being cognizant of the reality of it. The irony of it is people die way more often in the car than they do on a plane. So it's, as a private pilot, yes, you hear about what the worst case is, because as an 80-20 rule, there's so few crashes that when there is a crash, it becomes 80% of people's, all small planes are dangerous and people die all the time. Reality is that doesn't happen. It's fairly limited at all, which is why anytime it does happen, it's a big deal because it's such a small number. So going back to when you jump into that plane, you know nothing the first time you're learning how to fly a plane. You may have read all the textbooks. You could score perfect on the ground school. But anybody will tell you, I don't care who you are and how much you know, when you first get into the plane, when you first go through the process, it is a completely different feeling. Now, that feeling is, I don't know, I'm uncertain, I feel like an idiot, I don't know if this is ever going to work out. And you start to get used to it, and then they say you're going to go solo. So what's a solo flight? Solo flight is, you got to go by yourself for the first time. The first solo flight is typically the last flight that most people take when they're learning, because they never take the solo flight because they're too afraid. And I'll tell you from personal experience, there's a lot of anxiety. You're there. At the time, I landed at another airport, and my instructor was on the ground and said, go do it. And I just went around and around, but what's called touch and goes. Basically, landing, taking off, going around, landing, taking off, going around. That was my first solo. But psychologically, there was a transition there. He was there, he was watching me, and I had this mental state that, okay, I just went through and just did this, just stopped, I'm going to do the exact same thing again. Well, you do it over and over and over again, you feel a little more comfortable. The irony is, but common sense is, the third time that you do it is no more dangerous than the first time you do it, but you feel 3 times less uncomfortable because you've done it multiple times. Same thing with Pomodoro technique. The assumption is that within the 20 minutes that you first attempt to go and accomplish the whatever task, you're not going to get it perfect. So that's where you take a break, do nothing related to it, go back to it again and again and again. Now you combine that with a pincer method of long-term memory, it always works. You will ace every SAT, I promise. You will ace the IQ. You will be a genius on an IQ test. You will have perfect grades, perfect scores, and you can master any skill, period. The number of skills that I have is, when I list them out to myself and I reflect, oh, that's a lot of stuff that I can do. It has nothing to do with intelligence. Part of it has to do with motivation, the why. Once you know the why I want to learn how to master golf, or why I want to learn how to fly a plane, or why I want to do any of these levels of skill to master, it becomes easier. If you hate academics and you're trying to do SAT, you have a huge conflict there. So your negative relationship, your neuro-linguistic programming against academics may deter you from taking the SAT and scoring well. But Pomodoro technique plus pincer method, guaranteed. You know why I say guaranteed? We actually created a statistical curve for 100% of our customer base for that SAT prep or that prep school tutoring program. This many hours, this methodology, in this time frame will guarantee this score. So I'm not saying that the person who has a terrible score is going to get to a perfect in the same amount of time of a person out of a 1600 scale. If you got a 1500, getting to a 1600, it is exponentially more difficult, but it's not necessarily exponential more time. So if you got like a, I don't know, 750, I don't even know if that's possible. Probably not possible to get a 750 on an SAT. So you get a 1,000 on an SAT. To get from a 1,000 score to a 1,600 score, yes, is going to be way longer than a person from 15 to a 1,600. But it is literally time that you are spending in it. And we've proven it every single time. Anybody, and we do a tracking system for that school, and this is over 10 years ago, we did tracking methodology. You would log in, you would put your hours, and we could track exactly how you're going to score within less than 10% difference of what the score actually was. And we knew, and there was no like genius thing about it. There was no like, oh, I am a lot smarter than this person. It has nothing to do with that. It's pure to do with methodology and training and technique than it does to do with some special brain powers that you have. Now, to the public, it may seem as though you have some special magical powers, but the reality is that you just sucked it up and went through that whole process and you didn't give up. That has to go back to do with grit score. Grit score has to do with if you're aligned. So if you're aligned with a high grit score and then you're approaching an activity trying to get Pimsleur methodology within Pomodoro technique, you start combining it, you become invincible. You can learn languages, you can master pretty much any computer language, you can master any type of skill set that you want to add onto yourself. But again, none of that is as useful as working with a team. So you combine all these things together and you get to a whole nother level. We talked about the snooze and schedule email function. And like I said, I use Outlook on the phone and I use Airmail and Mailbird on Mac and Microsoft. And then one big thing that I do, and all the entrepreneurs I've invested in, I try to force them to have notifications on the phone. I think everybody's been alive long enough that there were no smartphones and no cell phones at all. And you had to get relayed to get information to you. The world did not collapse 20 years ago, not even 20 years ago before smartphones. What was it, only 10 years ago before smartphones, or before the iPhone, I should say. But you don't need notifications. Shut it all off. Turn everything off. But have a technique in place so you have a consistency of communication. 1Password is a software that I use. I have extraordinarily complex passwords. And it's something that, again, I want to remove everything from my head and put it into systems. 1Password is a multi-sync, complex password and complex data storage encrypted architecture that I use for things like credit card numbers and bank account numbers and passwords. And every one of my passwords are all different. There's some themes, but I use highly complex architectures around that, so that helps me a lot in being more effective, timely. Now, from an energy standpoint, although I love my steak and filet mignon, I don't eat that every day of the week, or hamburgers or anything like that. Generally speaking, and I've probably thrown in a little bit more, even probably within that last 90 days or so. So the pescatarian or more fish and non-starchy vegetable approach, which I think is one of the most effective ways of getting your omega oils and also all the things that you need for your body. So I think of it as fuel for everything else I'm trying to accomplish, as opposed to thinking of it as just something yummy to eat, which is why I don't really drink coffee at all, or refined sugars, or actually everything else out of this. And if I do, it's extremely, extremely rare. So that's about it. Hopefully there's some useful information here. Let's see if anybody else is on the call. Let's see, back to 7 participants. Let me see if I can unmute you guys. Okay, anybody have any questions?
Did you make this deck available?
The deck is available by link, and I've recorded the entire thing, so we'll make it available.
So what's the beginner's guide to starting this?
Yeah. Okay. So let me see. Let me put this back here. It was fun. Actually, whenever I started, there was nobody on it, so I was recording this with the assumption that nobody was actually on the call. But let's see. Let me get back on
Did everyone hear my question?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so beginner's guide. It's the why. You have to have a why that is so big that blows everything in your entire life away. It has to be something, at least for me, why in the universe would I want to wake up at 4? So on Wednesdays, one of the things I was saying before is to a couple of people is I wake up on Wednesday at about 4:30 in the morning and train with a group of former Special Forces guys from 5 a.m. to about 6:30 in the morning. No comfortable person in their life would want to wake up at 4:30 in the morning, right? Or wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But I write these whys down every single quarter. Personal Power 2 is the easiest framework to codify, go through the questions, write down the why. My whys are about 1,000 times more powerful than they were 20 years ago, but nothing is going to get in my way at this point in life because I will not let anything get in the way of what I'm trying to accomplish. Is my why is so aligned with all these other areas that all these other techniques just kind of enhance the why and make it more effective and more efficient and rapidly deployed versus knowing or not knowing, why I'm trying to do what I'm doing. Like if I'm here to get a job and a paycheck, that's never a big enough why. Almost anybody who's had a job long enough knows that the paycheck itself can't be the reason why you're doing something that just lasts for a short period of time. So yeah, and then also understanding what your weaknesses, right? That Personal Power 2 also kind of helps you understand like your passion in alignment with your strength, rather than passion alignment with what you think is cool. So I know a bunch of people, sure there's Muggsy Bogues, you can always find an outlier. Muggsy Bogues, shortest, one of the top best basketball players, I think it was 5'2", and he could do it at slam dunk. But the odds of a 5'2" person playing in the NBA is so low that it's not practical. So I'm not a huge fan of passion for the sake of passion. I'm kind of like, do you want to be passionate about something that makes sense for you and is in alignment with who you are? Hey, if you're obsessed about basketball, go ahead and be obsessed about basketball. Who am I to tell you to stop? But
what about balancing the why with an attitude of selfishness, self-centeredness? Don't get in my way. This is so big, I can't even think about it.
Well, the irony of it is that, remember we talked about how, let me go back to that slide. Whenever you go to Agile framework, you can't do Agile framework by yourself.
Right.
The irony of it is beyond anybody's religious beliefs, the theory of why Jesus died is for everybody else, right? The irony of it is also a highly selfish thing to do. He's doing it for himself to help other people. So I kind of look at that as an absolute extreme. Whatever your beliefs are, it doesn't make a difference from my standpoint. But in order for you to achieve personal mastery and absolute fulfillment of why, you can't do it by yourself. So what it means is that you then have to become a supporter to empower the other people around you in order to accomplish all those things. And that's kind of how I look at it. Personally, the more selfish I've been, the more selfless I have to be. The more I have to encourage people, the more I have to support other people, the more I have to empower other people, more that I need to figure out how I can support the other people around me. For example, I talked to Mary, my wife, just even last week, and I was saying, do you realize that what I'm trying to accomplish in my life is more important than my family? But the irony of that is that without my family, I could never accomplish that which I want to get fulfilled, which allows me to look at my family as something even more critical than just somebody I want to spend time with and family. It's just a way of thinking about it. But to its extreme, it makes sense. Halfway there being selfish means that you're like, well, screw everybody. I don't really care about anything. I'm just going to focus on myself. But if I look at my children as I need to support them because they support me, then there's this interdependency that their success makes me more successful, that Mark Galvin's success as an account manager makes me more successful. So me being more selfish makes me want to support you even more, but it doesn't really work halfway there. Halfway there, it's like, screw you, just do whatever the hell I say because I got my own things to do and I want you to do it for me. That mentality is a halfway approach. The extreme, ironically, allows you to be more empathetic, saying, how can I support you? How can I serve you? How can I make sure that your alignment in life is in my alignment? And that we find people that have the same values and principles and alignment in life, as opposed to saying, you just need to work for me because I'm paying you a paycheck. That doesn't work. Anybody else on the call have questions? Well, either way, it is recorded. I don't know.
Tom, are you on? Who's 941?
It's a Pittsburgh phone number. Anyways, well, thanks, guys. I guess we'll catch up soon. Have a great New Year's. I think the last people is Daniel, Greg, and that's it. All right, guys. Take care.
Thank you.